If your mind feels busy tonight, if your thoughts won't slow down, then you don't need to fix anything. You don't need to figure anything out. Just listen. Tonight's story is slow, quiet, and gentle. Nothing dramatic will happen, and that's exactly why it might help you rest. So, settle in, take a breath, and let's begin. There is a certain kind of afternoon light in Milford Junction that does not hurry itself. It settles, not all at once, and not with any particular urgency, but slowly the way a thought comes to you just as you are about to fall asleep. And if you happen to be walking down Maple Street at that hour, somewhere between the last sound of a distant lawnmower and the soft clatter of a screen door closing, you might notice how everything feels just slightly more present than usual. The houses seem to lean into the sunlight. The trees hold their shadows a little longer. And even the breeze, if there is one, moves with a kind of careful intention, as though it has somewhere to be, but is in no great rush to get there now. Milford Junction has always been the sort of place where people notice small things, not because they are looking for them, exactly, but because the days here leave enough space for noticing. And it was on just such an afternoon when the lilacs along Mrs. S. Havley's fence were beginning to fade at the edges, and the air carried that faint, familiar scent of warm grass and distant rain, that the matter of the slightly crooked sign outside the post office first came to anyone's attention. Not a large thing, not the sort of thing you would expect to stir much conversation. Just a sign, wooden, painted a soft, dependable blue some years ago, and mounted, as it had always been, just beside the front steps of the post office, where folks passed it every day without much thought, except now it leaned only a little. Enough that if you were not looking directly at it, you might miss it altogether, but enough also that once you did notice it, it became rather difficult not to. Mrs. Dorsey was the first to say anything about it. She had come down that morning just after 9, as she always did, wearing her housecoat and carrying a small canvas bag with her mail already sorted in her mind. She paused at the steps, looked at the sign, and tilted her head slightly, as though adjusting her own perspective might straighten it out. "Well now," she said, though no one in particular was there to hear it, "that does seem a touch off." She did not linger. Mrs. Dorsey was not one to make a fuss over small things, but as she stepped inside and the door gave its usual gentle chime, she carried the thought with her in the same quiet way one carries a tune without realizing it. By mid-morning, the matter had found its way to the bakery, not directly. Nothing in Milford Junction ever travels directly. It moves instead through small observations and passing remarks, gathering shape as it goes. Mrs. Jensen, who had been arranging a tray of cinnamon rolls behind the counter, mentioned that the post office sign looked as though it might have shifted in the night, to which Mr. Larkin, seated at his usual spot near the window, replied that the ground had been a bit soft lately, and that it would not take much for a thing like that to lean. Given the right conditions, No one disagreed. There was a quiet sort of satisfaction in having a reasonable explanation, even if no one had actually seen the sign move. And so the day went on. The sunlight drifted a little further across the sidewalks. The air warmed. The town settled into its familiar rhythm. But every so often, someone would pass the post office, pause for just a moment longer than usual, and take note of the sign. Not with concern, not even with much curiosity, just a quiet acknowledgement that something, however small, had shifted. And in Milford Junction, that was often enough. Before we move any further along, I find myself wondering something. When was the last time you noticed a small thing? Something so ordinary, you might have passed it 100 times before, but this time it stayed with you. You can think on that for a moment. There is no hurry here. Now then, by the time the noon hour came round, and the church bell marked it with its usual steady tone, the sign had become something of a gentle topic, not a problem, not quite a mystery, more like a shared observation that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Mr. Lyle, from the hardware store, took a look at it on his way back from delivering a small box of screws to Mrs. Callahan. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, considering, then gave the sign a light tap with his knuckle, as though expecting it to respond. It did not, of course, but the gesture seemed to satisfy him. Nothing wrong with it, he said quietly to himself. Just leaning is all. And with that, he went on his way. As the afternoon stretched out, the shadows lengthened across Maple Street. The breeze picked up just enough to stir the leaves along the curb. And somewhere in the distance, a train passed through the junction, its whistle carrying that familiar far-off sound that never quite disturbs the quiet, only settles into it. The sign remained where it was, still leaning, still unnoticed by some, quietly observed by others, and entirely unbothered by the attention it had begun to gather in Milford Junction. Things have a way of finding their place even when they are not quite straight. And sometimes it is the smallest shift that reminds people to look a little closer, to pause, to notice, and perhaps to let things be just as they are. The day eased gently toward evening, and the sign remained. And as evening began to settle over Milford Junction, it did so in that unhurried way the town had always preferred. The light softened first, not all at once, but gently, as though someone had placed a thin curtain between the sun and the rooftops. The edges of things grew quieter. The colors of the houses along Maple Street took on that warm, familiar tone that comes just before dusk, and the crooked sign outside the post office, still leaning ever so slightly to one side, seemed to catch the last of the light in a way it had not before. Not brighter, just different. Now, by this time of day, folks in Milford Junction tend to drift into their evening routines. Some return home with small paper bags tucked under their arms. Others pause on their porches, resting a moment before heading inside. And a few like M.R. Dorsey, preferred to take the long way back, passing by the same places they had already seen once that morning, just to see how they looked now in the changing light. He slowed as he reached the post office, not stopping entirely, just enough to let his eyes settle on the sign. He adjusted his hat, looked at it from one angle, then another. "Well," he said softly, as though finishing a thought he had not quite started earlier, "it suits the place." Somehow, and with that, he continued on, his footsteps fading into the soft hush of the evening street. Across the way, the windows of the bakery glowed with a quiet warmth. Mrs. Jensen was inside, wiping down the counter in slow, practiced motions, while a radio played something low and steady in the background. She paused once just for a moment and glanced out toward the street. Her gaze landed, as it had a few times already that day, on the post office sign, and though she did not say anything, she gave a small nod to herself, as if confirming something, or perhaps simply acknowledging that the day had unfolded just as it needed to. Now, if you had been there at that hour, standing somewhere between the bakery and the post office, you might have noticed how the town itself seemed to settle, not into silence, but into something softer than sound, the kind of quiet that holds things gently, that allows thoughts to come and go without needing to be followed. And in that quiet, the crooked sign no longer seemed out of place. If anything, it seemed to belong more fully than it had before, as though it had always been meant to lean just so. Night came slowly after that. The sky deepened. The first porch lights flickered on, and one by one, the small sounds of the town folded into themselves. A screen door closing here, a distant voice there, the soft rhythm of footsteps heading home. The sign remained unchanged, and yet not entirely the same, because now it had been noticed, and in Milford Junction, that is often all it takes for something to become part of the story. The next morning arrived quietly, earlier than most would have preferred. The kind of morning where the light comes in pale and soft, and the air still carries a trace of the night before. The dew sat low on the grass. The robins had already begun their gentle fussing in the hedges, and the town, for a brief moment, seemed to hold its breath before beginning again. Mrs. Callahan was among the first out that day. She stepped onto her porch with a cup of tea in hand, pausing at the top step to take in the air. It was cooler than the day before, not cold, just enough to notice. She made her way down the sidewalk at an easy pace, her shoes making that soft, familiar sound against the still damp pavement. And as she approached the post office, she slowed, not out of surprise, not even out of curiosity, but simply because she knew what she would see. The sign still leaning, still exactly as it had been. She stood there for a moment, took a sip of her tea, and then, quite naturally, reached out and placed her hand lightly against the wooden edge. Not to fix it, not to straighten it, just to feel it. as though confirming that it was real, that it had not shifted again in the night. After a moment, she withdrew her hand, gave the sign a small, almost thoughtful look, and continued on her way. By the time the post office opened, the morning had begun to take shape. The bell above the door gave its usual gentle chime. The mail sorted itself into its familiar patterns, and the first few visitors of the day arrived in that quiet, unspoken rhythm the town had always known. Mr. Larkin stopped by, as he often did. He glanced at the sign as he passed, paused, then shook his head slightly, though there was no disapproval in it, only recognition. "Still there," he murmured, as if the sign had been expected to correct itself overnight. Inside, Mrs. Dorsey was already at the counter, flipping through a small stack of envelopes. She looked up as M.R. Larkin entered. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. A brief pause, then, almost as an afterthought, "You seen that sign out front?" Mrs. Dorsey gave a small smile. "I have," she said. "And what do you make of it?" Mr. Larkin considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "Seems it's decided how it wants to be." Mrs. Dorsey nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe it has." And that was all that needed to be said. The day unfolded in its usual way. The sunlight came and went behind passing clouds. The breeze shifted now and then, carrying with it the faint scent of lilacs that had not yet fully let go of the season. People came and went. Some noticed the sign, some did not. And those who did noticed it a little less each time, not because it had changed, but because it had become familiar. And that, in Milford Junction, is how most things settle, not with resolution, but with quiet acceptance. Now, before we go any further, I find myself thinking of something. Sometimes it is not the straight things that stay with us, not the things that are perfectly aligned or exactly as expected, but the small, gentle differences, the slight tilt, the soft imperfection, the detail that asks nothing of us except to be seen. You may have something like that where you are. Something small, something easy to overlook. And yet once you notice it, it becomes part of the place, part of the feeling. You can think on that for a moment. There is still plenty of time. By mid-afternoon, the town had warmed again. The shadows shortened. The distant hum of a lawnmower returned, steady and unbothered. And the crooked sign stood as it had since the day before. No one had moved it. No one had tried, and perhaps that was the most noticeable thing of all. Because in a place like Milford Junction, things are often fixed, adjusted, tended to, but this had been left alone. And in being left alone, it had found its place. As the hours passed, fewer people paused when they walked by, fewer heads tilted, fewer comments made their way into quiet conversations. Not because the sign no longer mattered, but because it had become part of the rhythm, part of the background, like the sound of the bell, or the way the light falls across the street at a certain hour. And as evening approached once more, and the town prepared to settle again into its familiar quiet, the sign remained, leaning just slightly, exactly as it was, exactly as it needed to be. And in Milford Junction, that was enough for one day, and the next day came along in much the same quiet fashion, not with any announcement, not with any great sense of beginning, but simply as mornings do in Milford Junction. The light returned first, soft and pale at the edges, then a little stronger as it found its way across the rooftops and down along Maple Street, touching the sidewalks and the porches in that familiar, unhurried way. There was a stillness to it, the kind that lingers just long enough for a person to notice. And if you happened to be awake early enough, you might have heard the distant hum of the milk truck making its way along the far road, or the quiet shuffle of someone opening a back door to let in the morning air. Now, the crooked sign outside the post office remained exactly where it had been, leaning unchanged, and yet by this third morning, it had settled into something more than just an observation. It had become expected. Mrs. Jensen noticed this first, not in any grand realization, but in the simple fact that when she stepped out of the bakery to sweep the front step, she did not pause, she did not tilt her head. She simply glanced once at the sign and went on with her sweeping, as though it had always been that way. And that is often how things change in a place like Milford Junction. Not all at once, not with any clear moment of decision, but slowly until what once stood out becomes part of the ordinary. Inside the bakery, the morning carried on as it always did. The trays were set, the coffee poured, the bell above the door chimed now and then as the first few customers wandered in, drawn more by habit than by any particular need. Mr. Larkin took his usual seat by the window. He folded his newspaper carefully, set it beside his cup, and looked out toward the street. His eyes passed over the sign, paused for just a fraction of a second, then moved on. He reached for his coffee, took a slow sip, and nodded to himself. Whether in agreement with the morning, or simply with the way things were, no one could say. Across the street, the post office opened with its familiar rhythm. The door unlocked, the bell gave its gentle chime, and Mrs. Dorsey stepped inside, just as she had the day before, and the day before that. Only this time she did not comment on the sign. She noticed it, of course. One does not stop noticing something entirely, but the thought passed through her mind as easily as the air moved through the open doorway. Present and then gone. Now, if you had been watching from a distance, you might have found it curious how quickly something new becomes familiar, how easily a small change settles into place. But in Milford Junction, this was not unusual. It was simply the way of things. By mid-morning, the town had found its pace again. The sunlight warmed the pavement. The shadows drew back just enough to make room for the day, and the quiet sounds of routine began to fill the spaces between the buildings. A lawnmower somewhere behind the church, the low murmur of voices near the diner, the soft rustle of leaves along the curb as a breeze passed through without much intention. And through it all the sign remained, not corrected, not adjusted, just present. Mr. Lyle passed by around 10, carrying a small paper bag from the hardware store. He slowed slightly as he approached the post office, not because he meant to stop, but because his steps seemed to do so on their own. He looked at the sign, gave it the same brief consideration he had given it the day before. Then, almost without thinking, he reached out again and tapped it lightly with his fingers. A habit now, a quiet acknowledgement. The wood gave a soft, hollow sound in response. He nodded once, satisfied, and continued on his way. Now, it was around this time that something else began to take shape. Not in the sign itself, but in the way people moved around it. At first, it was hardly noticeable. A slight shift in step, a small adjustment in path, but gradually it became clear that those who passed by were giving the sign just a little more room. Not out of caution, and not because it leaned enough to be in the way, but simply because it did. And in Milford Junction, people tend to make room for things that have found their place. Mrs. Callahan stepped a little to the left as she climbed the post office stairs. Young Tommy Wilkes, on his way past with his bicycle, gave it a gentle curve without slowing down. Even the mail carrier, Calvin, adjusted his route just slightly as he made his morning rounds. None of it was spoken. None of it needed to be. It was simply understood. Before we go on, I wonder something. Have you ever noticed how people move around small changes? Not with resistance, not with effort, but with a kind of quiet understanding, as though the world has shifted just a little, and they have chosen to shift with it. It is not something that draws attention, but once you see it, you cannot quite unsee it. You can let that thought rest for a moment. There is no need to hurry. By noon, the bell at the church rang out, steady and familiar. Its sound drifted over the rooftops and settled into the streets below. And for a brief moment, everything paused. Just as it always did, people looked up or stopped what they were doing, or simply let the sound pass through them. And then the day continued. The sign stood there in the sunlight, its shadow now falling at a slight angle across the ground, and if you looked closely, you might have noticed how that shadow had become part of the pattern of the sidewalk. Not out of place, not unusual, just another shape among many. The afternoon came and went in its usual unhurried way. The light shifted. The breeze carried with it the faint scent of something blooming just out of sight. And the town carried on. There were no discussions now about the sign. No quiet debates at the bakery. No passing remarks at the hardware store. It had moved beyond that. It had become part of the place. And perhaps that is the way with many things. They begin as something noticed, something slightly out of line, something that asks for attention. But if left alone, if allowed to settle, they become part of the story. Not the whole of it, but a small, steady peace. As evening approached once again, the sky softened into those gentle tones that seemed to belong only to this hour. The kind of light that does not demand to be seen, but is noticed all the same. Porch lights flickered on. The distant sound of a train carried across the fields. And the streets grew quieter. One small moment at a time, the sign remained, leaning just as it had from the beginning, and now no one expected it to be any other way. And in Milford Junction, that quiet acceptance, that gentle shift from noticing to understanding was more than enough. For another day had passed, and everything, just as it was, felt exactly as it should. And by the fourth morning, something curious had happened. Not to the sign, it still leaned, just as it always had since that first quiet shift, but to the way the town felt about it, because now it was no longer something people noticed. It was something they had quietly made space for. And in Milford Junction, that is often the final step in any small change, not fixing it, not questioning it, but letting it belong. The morning came in soft and slightly cooler than the days before. There was a thin layer of cloud across the sky, enough to dim the sunlight just a touch and give everything a kind of gentle, even tone. The grass still held the last of the dew, and the air carried that faint, early hint that the season might be shifting, though no one would say so just yet. Mrs. Dorsey stepped out onto her porch at her usual hour, a cup of tea in hand. She paused for a moment, as she often did, letting the quiet settle around her. Then she made her way down Maple Street, her steps steady and unhurried. As she passed the post office, her eyes moved naturally toward the sign, not because she intended to look, but because it had become part of what she expected to see. And when she saw it there leaning just slightly, exactly as before, she gave the smallest of nods, not approval, not acknowledgement. Something softer than both, something like agreement now. It was around mid-morning when the first real shift in the story began to take place. Not in any obvious way, not the sort of thing that would draw attention, but in a detail so small it might have been missed entirely. Had Milford Junction not been the kind of place where small things are noticed, the shadow of the sign had changed, only slightly, just enough that it now fell across the edge of the post office steps instead of the sidewalk, a simple matter of the sun's position. Nothing more, and yet it caught the eye of Mr. Larkin as he approached. He stopped just for a moment, looked down at the shadow, then up at the sign, then back again. "Well now," he murmured quietly, "that's something." He did not explain what he meant. There was no need, because in that moment he had not discovered anything new, only noticed something that had always been there waiting. Inside the post office, the morning carried on as usual. Letters sorted, packages stacked, the soft shuffle of paper and the quiet exchange of greetings filled the small space. Mrs. Dorsey stood at the counter, speaking with Calvin, the mail carrier. They were discussing nothing in particular, the weather, the timing of deliveries, the usual things that fill the space between moments. But as Calvin turned to leave, he paused by the door, looked at the sign, then at the shadow stretching across the step, and without saying a word, he stepped slightly to the side as he exited, not to avoid the sign, but to avoid its shadow, as though it too now held a place. By noon, a few others had noticed. Not everyone, just enough. Mrs. Callahan, on her way in, lifted her foot just slightly higher as she stepped over the shadow. Young Tommy, wheeling his bicycle, guided it carefully around the edge of it. Even Mr. Lyle, who had never given much thought to shadows before, paused long enough to consider its position before continuing on. No one spoke of it, and yet it was happening. A small adjustment, a quiet respect, not for the sign itself, but for the space it had begun to create. Before we move along, I want to ask you something. Have you ever noticed how certain things begin to carry a presence? Not because they change, but because you begin to see them differently. A shadow, a sound, a small detail that once passed unnoticed now, holding a place in your awareness. It is a quiet kind of noticing, the kind that does not ask for attention, but holds it anyway. You can rest with that thought for a moment. There is no need to rush forward. The afternoon unfolded slowly. The clouds thinned. The sunlight returned in soft patches across the street, and the shadow of the sign shifted once more, stretching now a little longer, a little thinner, as the day moved toward evening. And with it, the small adjustments continued, not deliberate, not planned, just happening. People stepped around it, paused near it, moved with it, as though it had always been part of the path. And perhaps, in some quiet way, it had. Now, it was near the late afternoon hour, that gentle time when the town begins to lean toward evening, when something else occurred, not to the sign, not to the shadow, but to the feeling of the place itself. Because for the first time since the sign had leaned, no one noticed it at all. Not truly. They saw it, of course they did, but they did not register it as something separate. It had crossed that quiet line, from something to observe to something that simply is. And in Milford Junction, that is where most stories come to rest. As the sun began its slow descent, the light turned warmer. The edges of the buildings softened, and the long shadows of the evening stretched gently across the street. The sign remained leaning, as it always had, its shadow now long and quiet across the ground, no longer avoided, no longer examined. Just part of the day, the town settled once more. Porch lights came on, doors closed softly. Voices faded into the evening air, and somewhere in the distance, the familiar sound of a train passed through, not interrupting the quiet, but becoming part of it. And if you had walked past the post office at that hour, you might not have noticed the sign at all. Not because it had changed, but because it had become complete. And in Milford Junction, that is often how things end. not with resolution, not with answers, but with a quiet understanding that some things do not need to be straight to belong, that some things do not need to change to be right, and that sometimes it is enough to simply let them be. The night came gently after that, and the town rested, and sometime in the night, while Milford Junction slept in its usual quiet way, something small happened, not the sort of thing that would wake anyone, not the sort of thing that would be heard over the soft rhythm of crickets or the distant hush of wind moving through the trees. Just a shift, a gentle one, the kind that might go entirely unnoticed, if not for what it left behind. Morning arrived as it always did, slow, uncertain at first. A pale wash of light, finding its way across the rooftops and into the spaces between houses, touching the sidewalks and the fences in that familiar, unhurried pattern. The air was cooler now, not sharply so, but enough that a person might pause at their door and consider whether a sweater was needed. And the town, for a brief moment, held that quiet stillness between night and day, the kind of stillness that feels like a breath waiting to be taken. Mrs. Callahan was among the first to notice. She had come out early, earlier than usual, with a small basket in hand and the intention of walking just a little further than she normally did. She moved down Maple Street at her steady pace, her footsteps soft against the pavement, and as she approached the post office she slowed, not because she expected anything to be different, but because something felt different. She could not have said what it was, not at first. Asterisk only that the space around the sign seemed altered. She took another step, looked more closely, and then she saw it. The sign was still leaning, just as before, but the angle had softened, only slightly, so slight, in fact, that anyone who had not seen it every day might have missed it entirely. But Mrs. Callahan had seen it, and she knew. "Well now," she said quietly, more to herself than to the morning air. "That's new." She set her basket down gently at her feet and took a small step closer. Not to touch it, not to test it, just to look. The wood caught the early light in a different way now. The shadow, too, had shifted, no longer crossing the step as it had the day before, but falling just beside it, as though reconsidering its place. Mrs. Callahan stood there for a moment, then gave a small nod, picked up her basket, and continued on her way. By mid-morning, the change had begun to make its way through the town, not quickly, not all at once, but in the same quiet manner as before. Mrs. Jensen mentioned it first at the bakery. She had noticed, while opening up, that the sign looked a touch more upright. Mr. Larkin, seated by the window, glanced out and considered it. "Could be the ground settling," he said, "or the wind shifting things back." No one argued. There was comfort in simple explanations. Even when no one had seen the wind. At the post office, Mrs. Dorsey stepped up to the counter and paused. She looked at the sign through the window, tilted her head, just as she had on that first day, and for a moment she seemed to measure it, not with tools, not with precision, but with memory. Then she gave the smallest of smiles. "Well," she said softly, "it seems to be finding its way, Calvin." Sorting a stack of envelopes nearby, glanced up. "You think it'll straighten out?" he asked. Mrs. Dorsey considered this, then shook her head gently. "I don't believe it needs to," she said. Outside, the day continued. The sunlight grew warmer. The clouds drifted slowly across the sky, casting soft patterns over the street, and the sign remained, still leaning, but not quite as much, as though, overnight, it had decided to ease into its place rather than hold itself there. Before we go on, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen something change not all at once, but gradually? So slowly that you only notice it because you remember how it used to be. A tree growing, a room settling, a habit shifting. It is a quiet kind of change. One that does not announce itself, but once you see it, you understand that it has been happening all along. You can sit with that thought for a moment. There is no need to hurry. By afternoon, more people had taken note, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with a kind of calm recognition. Mr. Lyle paused as he passed, tapped the sign lightly, as he had done before, then paused again. His brow furrowed, just slightly. "Well now," he murmured. "That's different." He did not say how. He did not need to, because the difference was not something to be explained, only something to be felt. The shadow of the sign had changed again. It no longer stretched quite as far, no longer held quite the same angle. It was shorter now, softer, less defined, and people moved around it differently. Not stepping over it as before, not avoiding it, but simply passing through it, as though it had lost the need to be noticed. The town adjusted once more, as it always did, quietly, without effort, without discussion, and the sign continued to settle, not into straightness, but into something else, something that did not ask to be measured or corrected or explained. As evening came, the sky softened again. The light took on that familiar golden tone, and the long shadows of the day stretched gently across the street. The sign stood there, still slightly tilted, still not quite straight, but now it felt complete in a different way, as though it had found a balance between what it was and what it had been. And in Milford Junction, that was more than enough, because things here are not always meant to return to how they were. Sometimes they are meant to settle into something new, something quieter, something softer, something that feels right even if it looks just a little different. The night came slowly after that. The porch lights flickered on, the streets grew quiet, and the town once again rested, and the sign remained exactly where it needed to be. The next morning arrived without hurry, not in the way mornings sometimes rush in with bright light and busy sounds, but in that softer way Milford Junction seemed to prefer. A pale sky, a quiet street, and the gentle sense that the day would unfold exactly as it meant to. There is a moment, just after dawn, when the town feels almost suspended. Not asleep, not fully awake, just waiting. And if you are out walking at that hour, you begin to notice things you might otherwise miss. The way the breeze moves through the hedges, the way the light rests on a window pane, the way even the smallest objects seem to carry a kind of quiet presence. It was during that hour that Mr. Harlan stepped out onto his porch. He stood there a moment, as he always did, one hand resting on the railing, his eyes adjusting to the morning. Then he looked toward the post office, not because he expected anything, but because, like many in Milford Junction now, he had gotten into the habit of checking. The sign was still there. Of course it was. But something about it drew his attention again. Not sharply, not urgently, just enough to make him pause. He narrowed his eyes slightly, took a slow breath, and then he noticed. The base of the sign had shifted only a little, barely enough to see unless you were looking for it. But the ground around it looked disturbed. Not freshly dug, not broken, just loosened, as though something beneath it had settled. "Well now," Mr. Harlan said quietly. He stepped down from the porch, walked a few paces closer, and stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. He did not touch the sign. He did not step into the grass. He simply stood there, observing, as if the act of watching was enough. After a moment, he gave a small nod, not of understanding, but of acceptance, and turned back toward his house. By mid-morning, the town had begun to stir. The bakery door chimed. The scent of bread drifted into the street. A lawnmower started somewhere in the distance. And once again, the quiet noticing began. Mrs. Clean was among the next to pause. She had come out with a paper sack in hand, heading toward the post office with her usual steady pace. But as she approached, she slowed. Her gaze moved from the top of the sign down to its base. And there she lingered. She said softly. Not puzzled, not concerned, just acknowledging. She adjusted the strap of her bag, stepped around the sign, and continued on. Inside the post office, the conversation drifted naturally toward it. Not all at once, not announced, just woven in. Like most things in Milford Junction, "I think it's settling," Calvin said. "Sorting envelopes. Ground's been damp this week, Mrs." Dorsey considered this, then nodded. "Could be," she said. "But it doesn't feel like sinking." Calvin looked up. "What do you mean?" She paused, searching for the right words, then smiled faintly. "It feels like it's finding its place." No one replied to that. Not because they disagreed, but because it did not need explaining. Outside, the day carried on. The sky cleared slowly. The sun warmed the sidewalks, and the sign remained as it was, slightly more settled, slightly more at ease. "Before we continue, let me ask you something quietly." Have you ever seen something change not by force, but by time? Not pushed, not fixed, but simply allowed to become what it was meant to be? Sometimes that is how the best things happen, not all at once, not with effort, but with patience. You can sit with that thought. No need to answer by afternoon. The shift had become part of the day, not remarkable, not unusual. Just present, Mr. Lyle passed by again. This time he did not tap the sign. He simply looked, tilted his head, and gave a quiet hum of approval. "Looks better," he said, though no one had asked. Children walked past after school. One of them slowed, looked at the sign, then looked at the ground and said, very matter-of-factly, "It moved." The others shrugged and kept walking, because in Milford Junction things moving slowly was not something to be questioned. Evening came again, soft, unhurried. The light stretched long across the street. Asterisk and the air carried that familiar scent of lilac and cooling earth. Mrs. Callahan passed by once more. This time she did not stop. She only glanced and smiled, as if greeting something she now understood, and the sign stood, still leaning, still imperfect, but steadier now, as though whatever had begun was continuing, quietly, surely, without asking for attention. Night settled in gently. The porch lights flickered on. The streets grew still, and the town rested once more, and somewhere, beneath the surface, something small continued to shift. Not enough to be seen, not enough to be heard, but enough to be felt, and that, in Milford Junction, was often how things changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but in quiet ways that stayed with you, long after you noticed them. The next morning did not announce itself, it simply arrived. Softly, like a thought you almost miss if you are not paying attention. There is a kind of light that comes just before the sun fully rises, not bright, not dim, but somewhere in between, as if the world is deciding how it wants to be seen. That was the kind of light resting over Milford Junction that morning. And in that light the sign waited. No one had come to check it yet. Not Mr. Harlan, not Mrs. Dorsey, not even the early walkers who usually passed by before breakfast. For a little while, it stood completely alone, and in that quiet something small happened. If you had been there, standing just across the street, watching without expectation, you might have noticed it. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough to make you pause. The sign shifted again, not in a way that startled, not in a way that called attention, but slowly, almost thoughtfully, it settled a fraction deeper into the ground. The soil around it gave way, not collapsing, but yielding, as though making room, and then it stopped. The moment passed so gently that it felt less like movement and more like completion, as if something that had been slightly out of place had now aligned. By the time the first footsteps approached, there was no sign of it. Only the result. Mrs. Adler was the first to arrive. She walked her usual path, her shoes making a soft rhythm against the sidewalk. She carried nothing in her hands that morning. No mail, no bag, just herself and the quiet of the hour. She slowed as she came near, not because anything seemed wrong, but because something felt different. She stopped, looked at the sign, then looked again. "Well," she said quietly, and after a moment, "That's better." She could not have said exactly why. Nothing obvious had changed. The paint was the same. The words were the same. The tilt still there, but softer now, less uncertain. Asterisk, she gave a small nod, the kind people give when something settles into place without needing explanation. And then she continued on. By mid-morning, others had begun to notice, not loudly, not all at once, but in that quiet, shared way the town had. At the bakery, "It looks different today," Doris mentioned. Setting down a tray, Calvin glanced up. "Different how?" She considered, then smiled. "Like it's decided where it belongs. At the library, mister?" Jensen paused longer than usual on the steps. Hands behind his back, eyes narrowed slightly. Then he gave a soft hum. "About time," he said. Though no one had asked the question, children passed it again. This time, one of them reached out, not to move it, not to test it, just to touch the edge lightly, as if confirming something. "It's not wobbly anymore," she said. The others nodded, satisfied, and moved on. The day unfolded gently after that. Clouds drifted, sunlight came and went. The sound of lawnmowers rose and faded, and the sign remained. "Before we go further, let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever noticed how some things don't need fixing? They just need time? Not adjustment, not interference. Just a little space to become steady on their own. It is easy to overlook that. But in places like Milford Junction, they seem to understand it. By afternoon, the change was no longer new. It had already become part of the day, part of the street, part of the rhythm. Mrs. Dorsey passed by once more. She stopped, looked closely, then reached out and pressed lightly against the wooden post. It held firm, unshaken. "Well now," she said softly. And for the first time since the sign had appeared, she did not adjust anything. She stepped back, smoothed her sleeve, and simply left it be. Evening came again, the kind that settles slowly, with long shadows and quiet air. The sign stood where it had been, but now it felt different. Not new, not mysterious, just belonging. And as the last light slipped across the grass, it seemed, for just a moment, that the town itself noticed, not in words, not in action, but in that quiet, shared understanding that something small had found its place. Night followed gently. The crickets began their steady chorus. Windows glowed softly, and Milford Junction rested once more. And if you had walked past the sign in that final hour, you might not have thought much of it at all. Just a simple wooden post in a small patch of grass on a quiet street, but something about it would have stayed with you. Not because it changed the town, but because it didn't need to. Sometimes the smallest things do not ask to be noticed, only to be allowed. The next morning came even quieter than the last. Not because anything had changed, but because everything had settled. There is a certain kind of stillness that follows when something finds its place. Not silence, but a calm that rests underneath everything. That was the feeling in Milford Junction that day. The sun rose slowly. The light spread gently across the rooftops, and the town moved as it always did, unhurried, untroubled. The sign stood where it had settled, no longer drawing glances, no longer inviting speculation. It had become part of the street, and that, in a place like Milford Junction, is how you know something belongs. When it stops being noticed. Mr. Harlan passed by that morning without stopping. He glanced once, gave a small nod, and continued on. Mrs. Dorsey walked past later, her step steady, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She did not pause, did not adjust anything, only allowed her gaze to rest there for a moment, and move on. At the bakery, the talk had shifted. To weather, to gardens, to the usual, gentle things. The sign was no longer a topic, because it no longer needed to be. Children passed it on their way to school. They did not point, did not question. One of them leaned briefly against it while tying a shoelace, then ran ahead, without a second thought. And so the day unfolded, like so many others before it. Before we drift a little further, let me ask you something softly. Have you ever noticed how peace doesn't arrive loudly? It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to be seen. It simply settles. And one day you realize everything feels a little steadier than it did before. That is what this day felt like. By afternoon, the breeze moved lightly through the trees. The lilacs swayed, the shadows stretched across the sidewalk, and the sign cast a small, quiet shadow of its own steady. Unwavering Mr. Lyle passed once more. He did not tap it this time. He simply sat on the nearby bench, looked out across the street, and after a while closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest, because there was nothing left to figure out, nothing left to fix, nothing left to wonder about. Evening came softly, as it always does. The sky turned pale gold, then lavender, then slowly blue. The church bell rang in the distance, not loud, not urgent, just enough to remind the town that time was still moving, as it always had, as it always would. Lights came on in the windows, porch chairs creaked gently, and the quiet of the night settled in once more. The sign stood in its place, no longer new, no longer uncertain, just there, and if you happened to walk past it in that final hour, you might not stop. You might not even look, but somewhere in you there would be a small sense of comfort, a feeling you could not quite name, as if something in the world, however small, was exactly where it was meant to be, and that feeling would stay with you. Not loudly, not insistently, but gently. Like the last thought before sleep, the kind you don't hold on to, but that carries you quietly into rest. And so, Milford Junction settled once more. The night deepened, the air cooled, and the world grew still. No questions left, no changes needed, just the soft, steady presence of things being as they are. And that was enough. Good night.